I am live here from my classroom to tell you all about some exciting things going on in the world, like all about Roman numerals. Today is all about Roman numerals. I am currently getting the joy of teaching Rome to my fantastic students. So therefore, I thought now is a good time to teach about Roman numerals, the math, the history. Oh, how it all comes together. Math, history, and ultimate confusion. Oh, yes. If you've ever been confused by Roman numerals before, well, this might not help you, but you'll get a little history lesson out of it and maybe learn a thing or two. So, first we're going to talk about the basics, Roman numerals. Most of you know them already, like the I stands for 1, the V is 5, the X is 10, the L is 50, the C is 100, the D is 500, and the M is 1,000. Now you're probably noticing something glaringly missing from this list. 0. Where is 0? I don't know where 0 is. I'm not sure. No clue. But neither did the Romans have any clue. They did not have a number to represent 0. They didn't need a number to represent 0 because they didn't use a place value system for their numerals. The Roman numerals were all based on counting off your fingers. Yes, like that fancy I. That fancy I stood for 1. That V, standing for 5, was meant to represent, there we go, the V that your hand makes when you encompass all 5 fingers from one side to the other. It makes a V. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now that X you're probably wondering about, well, upside down V and another V. 2 V's together. And if you know your multiplication, 5 times 2 is 10. There you go. Now the other numbers get a little bit more interesting, but we're going to actually pause before we get to those. The Roman numeral system was originally developed somewhere around 900 to 800 BCE, and that was a long time ago. That's over about 2,900 years ago or so, give or take a few. The Roman numerals today can be found in lots of places, but let's get back to our other letters, because it looks like we're missing an L, a C, a D, an M, and some fancy things down here. For our C, well, we're lucky that, when they were naming these things and coming up with them, some of them make sense, like the C. The C, in Latin, C, centum means 100. So they stole the front letter from the C for 100. The L for 50 makes a little bit less sense, I would say. This is what we know now. 50 originally was an arrow pointing up, then became an arrow pointing down, which turned into an inverted T, and then eventually lost the inverted T part altogether and just became an L. If you're confused and you wonder why all the changes, well, Rome went through a lot of changes themselves. They started out as a kingdom with kings ruling for 200 years. Then there was a senate, and people were able to vote and help make decisions, and there was a democracy. Then there was a dictatorship. Then things kind of turned into chaos. But through all the changes that happened through Rome, their systems changed as well. Or even the different people building the buildings who had different beliefs would change the systems while they were building the buildings. They would decide, nope, I'm going to use this letter for 1 and this for 5, and someone a few years later might change their mind completely and change those numbers around. It's really whatever worked for the Romans at that time. It was a constantly changing, evolving system, which I understand. There wasn't really a concrete system before this, and they were going to try to make one. So we've covered this portion and up to that C. Let's hit the D. So D stands for 500. Oh, but before we can do D, we do need to do M. M is 1,000. Originally, they used the Greek letter phi to represent 1,000, and that is this symbol right down here. Now, that's quite difficult to constantly write or scribe into things, especially if you're writing it into stone. So they separated it out. It also evolved into the infinity symbol, which then it became this symbol and eventually just the M. Now, mil also happens to mean 1,000 in Latin. This is actually ironic. They didn't try to do that one on purpose. It was originally here, and it transformed itself into the M. Back to the D. D stands for 500. Well, if that was 1,000, they just took off half of it to make the D for 500. That one makes sense. Now, the Romans also utilized additive notation and subtractive notation. Additive notation is probably what is easiest to remember about the Roman notation system. You put the numbers from largest to smallest, going left to right, and you add them all up. Seems simple, right? So you have a 5, 3 eyes, or a V and 3 eyes, so 5 plus 3 is 8. You're adding them all up. You start with the largest and work your way to the smallest. Same with larger numbers. You're starting with an L, which is 50, a few X's, that's 20. You've got a V and an I, 50, 20, 5, and 1. You add them all up, 76. Fantastic, right? Everyone can add. Adding is the greatest, easiest, most wonderful part about math. But the Romans also employed subtractive notation. Yes. And this is where it gets tricky. So, let's start with IX. Well, I is 1, and when a smaller letter is placed in front of a larger letter, it means you're subtracting. So, 1 less than 10 is 9. That's how you'd represent 9. Now it gets even more confusing when you have larger numbers and then you're putting smaller numbers in front of them. Such as for our number 14. You have a 10, and you are adding that 10 to the subtraction problem. So 10 plus 1 less than 5, which is 4, is 14. Smaller problems like this, not a problem. It's when suddenly you have giant numbers, such as when I was born in 1983, which, yes, for all of my students, is a very long time ago, and no, the dinosaurs were not still around at that time. But then you're involving an M and some D's and some C's and an L, and you're trying to add and subtract, and you're trying not to get confused. Confused? So are the Romans. All the time. Examples. The Romans had a very famous band of army men called the 22nd Legion, except in history books and information about them, lots of times we find it written as 220, the 220 legion. This is a completely strange way for us to see it. This doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't follow, it's sort of subtractive notation, but really it's not. There should be a 10 and a 5 and 4, 1, and this doesn't make sense. Except that in Latin, 22nd was actually was written as duo et vice, which means 2 and 20th. So the 22nd, or the 2 and 20th Legion, was one of Rome's most famous armies, and that's how they were written. Not XXII, but IIXX. Even some Roman sculptors in the later years were confused and were writing the 22nd Legion as the 18th Legion because they didn't know. The Colosseum is another great example, and this one is all a mess. So the Colosseum, that I'm sure many people have heard of, was built somewhere between 70 and 80 AD, and it uses actually a mixture of rules. It was whatever the builders thought to use at that time. Now, in the Colosseum, there are several doors, and they're said to have 79 doorways to enter the Colosseum, and they were all labeled. There are only a few doors left. All of these doors are numbered. That would be where people would enter the Colosseum. They'd have a ticket with the number on it. They'd enter through that specific doorway. It's actually said that 5,000 people could enter the Colosseum in about 10 minutes or less. I don't know, but that's a pretty cool fact. Nowhere on the Colosseum do they have the use of the 4, subtractive notation, IV, or a use of the 9, IX. So 29 is written as, door number 29 is written as XXVIII, which is 29. Door 54 is written as LIII, 54. But the Romans who were building it, the architecture, or the construction workers and the architects, utilized the X before the L. They utilized the 40 symbol. So that door 44, instead of 4 X's and then 4 I's, door 44 was written as XL III. Many times the Romans kind of picked and chose what they wanted to work with and write with. Now, something really interesting that I learned, and I've been teaching this for a while. Many of my students might know what this fancy line over the V is. Oh yeah, that line, that's a very important line. That line is going to take that V, which means 5, and it's going to multiply it by 1,000. So that V has now become 5,000. It gets better. If the V is in a box, a separated box, not even a contained box, there's little spaces, a sort of box, you are now taking that V and multiplying it by 100,000. Except, well, it's a V, so it's a 500,000. Crazy. Especially when this symbol can get very confusing. That almost looks like an IVI with a little box, or with a little cover on top. And actually, these symbols got confused all the time, especially when it came to writing out wills. The example of Caesar Tiberius was going through the will of his mother, and his mother had chosen to give one of her servants a total of this many denarians. Well, the Caesar at the emperor at the time was pretty certain that his mother was incorrect, that she really only meant to give 6,000 VI with a line, 6,000 of the amount of money, and that this was a decorative line. And well, he was Caesar at the time. He was the emperor. Who was going to argue with him? So even though they put these rules and guidelines in place, they were very, very often misused or just ignored completely. Now, Roman numerals, why do you need to know? Well, they're kind of everywhere still nowadays. They're on buildings. They're used at the end of movies to give dates. They're in titles and book chapters. They represent our Super Bowl. They're mentioned at the Olympics. They're on watches and clocks. They're used in the periodic table, in astronomy. Lots of other sciences use lots of other sciences use the Roman numerals as well. Really, their purpose now, though, is mainly cosmetic. Roman numerals represent a sense of timelessness and historical importance, not really a strong sense of math. And although your teachers, like me, will probably have you practice with Roman numerals and use them once in a while because, well, yeah, of course. They're great for practicing adding and subtracting and doing some mental math and really trying some of that critical thinking out, and that adding and subtracting and moving things here and there and working through confusion. It's a good thing to do. There's not a lot of strength to learn, or not a lot of real purpose to learn them to build any mathematical skills except, practicing that addition and subtraction. There's no zero. There's no order of, of number sense and place value. So although really cool to learn and a really neat trick to say, hey, bet you don't know what this number is, or hey, I bet I could do some math with this, you probably won't see this on many standardized tests, which is a good thing because we use a different sense. Now, two more things before I run away. One, there are fractions with Roman numerals. What? No. Yes, totally. The Romans used fractions, though, a little different than we did. We have decimals and decimal places, and we have our fractions that can be, we can have 1/2, we can have 1/10, we can have 1/50. Our place value system that we have allows for us to visualize and use fractions in any way. The Romans did not, because they didn't have a zero, they didn't have a place value. They used fractions, and the only kind of fractions they used were if they could be done in twelfths. So they could label and identify 1/12, 2/12, 3/12, and then all of those fractions that were similar as well. So you could have 6/12 or 1/2. You could have 3/4, which is also the same as 9/12. But everything was done in twelfths because that was their system. After the Roman collapse and the Roman Empire collapsed and the world of Christianity took over in that area, the Christians actually kept the Roman numeral system and then spent the next few years sort of changing it and editing it. And instead of using capital letters, they used lowercase i's and small v's and small x's and lowercase m's and uppercase m's. And they edited it to make it work for them and their system, which is really what this was. It was an evolving numerical system that changed for the next about 1,000 years until the fantastic Arabic system that we have today with base 10 and numbers and place value and all those fun things that we're now learning instead of this. But you should still learn this. So on that note, from Mrs. Colley's room, learning about Rome, go out and learn some Roman numerals. To all my students, you've got a homework assignment about this. I know, right? And we'll catch you later. See you guys. Thanks for joining.